Hi, I'm Steve from Universal Yachting, and I'm currently sat on the back of our brand new Do 441 in MDL's Mercury Yacht Harbour Marina on the River Hamble. And I'd like to take this opportunity to talk to you about taking your boat a little bit further afield than your regular cruising ground. Maybe it's going to be the first time you're taking your boat further afield. Maybe it's going to be the first time in a long time you've taken your boat further afield, but there are certain things that we need to start to consider when we're going out of our regular cruising ground. When we're sailing in our normal cruising ground, we can all be a little bit blasé. We'll jump on the boat in the morning, go for a sail, not really pay too much attention to the charts or maybe even the tides because we know where we are. Sail around for the day, come back, jump off the boat and all is good. But now we're starting to talk about going that little bit further. There are certain things we need to take into consideration. Okay, now we need to think about where we'd like to go on the trip, how long have we got to do it. Are we going to be staying along the UK coast? Are we going to be popping across the channel and visiting the Channel Islands? Maybe mainland France? Do we have 2 days for the trip? Do we have 2 weeks or even a month? It's all going to have a bearing on what we can achieve and where we can go. Who's coming sailing with us? Are we going to go on our own? Can be a little bit boring. Are we going with friends and family? Are we going with people that know everything there is to know about sailing? Again, this can all have a bearing on what you want to achieve on your little trip away. Time of year you're going. Are you going to be blessed with our glorious summer weather? Don't forget this is the UK and glorious summer weather can only be 1 week of the year. Or are you going in the autumn time when it's a bit more changeable, or winter time when we can have the winter storms blowing through? Once we've decided how long we're going to go for, where we'd like to go, and then the composition of the crew we're going to have with us, we can then start to look at putting a plan together to make it all happen. Now that we've worked out where we'd like to go and how long we've got to do the trip, we need to start thinking about passage planning. Now, you may not have done a passage plan before, you may not have done one for a long time, or you might do them regularly. But it's always good just to touch and refresh your memory of what we need to do in a passage plan. So, start and end locations. This sounds quite simple, but you've got to think about things of, do I feel confident going into or out of the harbour? If the answer is no, then it's a good idea to make sure you read the almanac or the channel pilot guide for that harbour, make a pilotage plan, make sure you've got any hazards that are on there, and also note down any VHF frequencies you might need for the marina or harbour master in those places. Along with start and end locations, you've also got to think, what if my trip doesn't go quite as I planned? What if I'm not going to make my final port? This could be due to mechanical failure, weather, or the crew being seasick. So we've got to look at ports of refuge on the way. So wherever you're going, try to have 1 or 2 places that you can comfortably get into if things don't go as planned. Tides. You know, we're sailing around the UK, so we've got to take tides into account. Tides can be our best friend, but they can be our worst enemy at the same tide. So do we have any tidal gates we need to make sure we hit at the right time? Are there any overfalls or areas of wind against tide that we need to make sure we definitely avoid? Do we have restrictions going into or out of any of our harbours, including our ports of refuge? So check all these before you go and make sure you have everything written down just so you can double check. Just put the high waters and any restrictions down that you need. Our crew, probably our biggest limiting factor on what we can do. Does our crew know how to sail the boat first of all, or are they solely depending on yourself? Have you briefed them on what to do in an emergency? God forbid something were to happen to you and they need to take control of the boat. Do they know who to call in an emergency? Do they know what to do if someone falls in the water? You've always got to think of the worst case scenario when it comes to the emergencies on board. Weather. Now, we can all go around the internet and pick the perfect weather forecast for our trip. But the best thing to do is take 2 or 3 or even 4 or 5 different sources of weather. Quite often, each of the bits of weather information you get out there come from different models, so look at the weather in a slightly different way. Instead of picking the best one for your trip, try and look at them as a whole unit and it'll give you a much better picture of what to expect when you're out there. So another thing we have to consider is, are we going over to Europe or the Channel Islands? With the UK no longer being a member of the European Union, there are some things we have to do a little bit extra. So we have to inform Border Force that the boat's leaving the UK, and again we have to inform them when the boat comes back. This can all be done online, and there's a lot more information to be found about it. When you go over to mainland Europe, you have to make sure you enter Europe via one of the ports of entry so you can clear the boat into customs and immigration. You also need to remember to fly the courtesy flag for the country that you're visiting, and a Q flag until the boat has been cleared through customs. And unfortunately, some of these regulations also apply when you're going into the Channel Islands. So the best thing to do is have a quick look online just to make sure you are up to date with all of the information regarding leaving the UK and then sailing through Europe. And also, one thing you might forget to take is your passport. So definitely make sure that you've got your passport on board. Okay, now that we've done our passage plan, we can turn our attention to the boat. Now, sailing in our local area, we might be a little bit blasé with the maintenance on the boat and what equipment we're carrying. But now we're going further afield, we need to make sure the boat's in tip-top condition. So we need to think about things like, when was the rig last inspected? When was the engine last serviced? Is the engine due a service soon? Is it worth doing it before you leave? Are you carrying the appropriate spares on board if you were to have a problem with the engine? Now, you'll most likely find an engineer in the harbour that can fix what's wrong with the engine, but they might not have access to the correct spares. So carrying a set on board will keep the downtime on the boat to a minimum and just keep you sailing to your next destination. Safety equipment. We're going sailing in places we haven't been before. Do we have the correct equipment on board? Is the equipment we have on board in date? You know, so jump on board, check your flares are in date, check your first aid kit's in date, check you've got everything you need in your first aid kit. If you're not sure what you should have in your first aid kit, then you can look at the MDL video on first aid and it'll give you a list of what you need in the kit. Life raft. Do we have a life raft? Now, don't rush out to buy a life raft. You can hire those things for short periods of time, but it's always good to have. A grab bag. Do we have a grab bag on board if the worst was to happen and we'd have to leave the boat? What's in the grab bag, if you do have one? And is the stuff in there in date? There are many references that you can find to see what should be put in your grab bag, but as a minimum, should be VHF, first aid kit, boat papers, and anything else you think is important, like flares for helping signal people. Okay, another thing to consider is the boat full of fuel? When was the last time you filled it up? So make sure you fill that boat with fuel. Something that people also forget is gas. So make sure you've got a new gas bottle on board, and ideally an additional one just in case you run out. And the same with your water. When was the last time you flushed your water tanks? So maybe empty your water tanks and fill them back up so you've got nice, clean, fresh water. Now, we were talking about passage planning earlier, which you've probably done at home. So make sure you put all of your charts, almanacs and pilot books back on the boat before you leave. The last thing you want to do is be halfway along the English Channel and realise you've forgotten the folio for the West Country. Then we come on to food. Now, it may seem a little bit basic this, but don't try and be Heston Blumenthal on board. You don't need to cook up a gastronomic feast for your crew on board while you're sailing. The last thing people want to do is spend hours down below in a hot galley. Nothing can make a crew seasicker quicker than sending people down to cook. So make it simple, make it relatively plain, and make it easy to grab. And then the final thing we need to think about is that this is supposed to be fun. So be safe, enjoy yourself. Things will happen when you're out sailing that you didn't anticipate, but embrace them. Don't get frustrated. The changeability of the sea is one of the things that makes our sport so exciting. So go out there, enjoy yourself, but most of all, be safe.